The stale smell of burnt breakroom coffee hit my nostrils before my eyes even opened. A heartbeat ago, my career was dead. My reputation shredded by the woman sitting 3 desks down. Now, the digital clock on the wall read 9 a.m., exactly 24 hours before the presentation that ruined my life. She wanted my work. This time, I'd hand it to her on a silver platter, complete with a poison pill she couldn't possibly see coming. Fluorescent light buzzed overhead, a persistent, low-frequency hum that vibrated right behind my molars. My cheek was pressed against the cold, faux wood laminate of my desk. The texture was slightly sticky, a residue of countless sanitized wipes and spilled lattes from the years I'd given to this cubicle. I sat up. My spine cracked, a sharp, dull ache settling into my lower back. My lungs pulled in a jagged breath of over-conditioned air. It smelled faintly of ozone dust mites and the sharp tang of printer toner. I blinked, the harsh overhead lighting burning into my retinas. The office was alive around me. Phones rang in muffled, discordant tones. The rhythmic clatter of fingers attacking keyboards formed a white noise backdrop. It was Tuesday. My eyes darted to the lower right corner of my monitor. October 14th. The date sat there glowing with indifferent finality. I swallowed hard. My throat felt like sandpaper. Yesterday, or what I thought was yesterday, was Wednesday the 15th, the day of the quarterly strategic alignment. The day I stood in front of the executive board, pulling up my meticulously crafted slide deck, only to find an unformatted, corrupted file staring back at me. The day Jessica sat 2 chairs away, projecting the exact 50-page analysis I had spent 6 weeks building, claiming she had stepped in to save the project, when she noticed my alleged negligence. The day Damian Preston, our CEO, looked at me with a mixture of disgust and pity before telling human resources to clear my desk. Yet here I was. My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against the desk, feeling the cool plastic edge bite into my palms. It wasn't a dream. The physical reality of the space was too dense, too utterly mundane to be a hallucination. The half-empty bottle of sparkling water sweating on my coaster. The slight fraying of the fabric on my chair's armrest. The dull throbbing in my temples from staring at spreadsheets until 3 a.m. I was back. A wave of nausea washed over me. It wasn't the triumphant, vindictive thrill you see in movies when someone gets a second chance. It was pure, unadulterated panic. My chest constricted. The memory of the humiliation, the absolute crushing weight of Damian's dismissal, the murmurs of my colleagues, the cardboard box cutting into my hands as I walked to the elevator, was so fresh it tasted like bile in the back of my throat. "Hey, you okay? You look like you're going to puke." The voice cut through my spiraling panic like a dull knife. I turned my head slowly. Jessica stood, leaning over the low partition separating our desks. She held a ceramic mug with some generic motivational quote printed on it. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a messy bun that probably took her 20 minutes to perfect. She smelled of synthetic vanilla and cheap, dry shampoo. My stomach churned. I looked at her face, the slight crinkle of fake concern around her pale blue eyes, the perfectly glossed lips pressed into a tight line. This was the face that would ruin me tomorrow. This was the woman who had snuck into my office while I was in the restroom, copied my files, corrupted my local drive with a script she probably bought online, and walked into the boardroom, playing the savior. I wanted to scream. I wanted to reach across the partition, grab the lapels of her overpriced beige blazer, and shake her until her teeth rattled. My muscles tensed, adrenaline flooding my veins, making my fingertips go numb. Instead, I forced a breath out through my nose. "I'm fine," I said. My voice sounded hollow, like it was coming from the end of a long tunnel. "Just tired. Long night." Jessica's smile widened, just a fraction. It was a predatory, micro-expression. She fed on weakness. "I bet. The Q3 alignment is a beast. You're still handling the macro trend analysis, right? I can take some of it off your plate if you're drowning." There it was, the opening maneuver. In the previous timeline, I had fiercely protected my work, snapping at her, that I had it under control. That defensiveness was what made her resort to outright theft. She needed to be the star, and I was in her way. I looked down at my keyboard. The letters on the A and S keys were worn away from use. A profound, bone-deep exhaustion settled over me, overriding the panic. I didn't want to be a hero. I didn't want to engage in some grand corporate warfare. I just wanted to pay my mortgage and sleep through the night without grinding my teeth. But the universe, or whatever cruel mechanism, had thrown me back 24 hours, had made it clear. Survival wasn't going to be clean. I looked back up at her, softening my features, playing the exhausted, overwhelmed drone she expected me to be. "Actually," I said, my voice quiet, "I might need a second set of eyes on it later. I'm just finishing up the final projections." Jessica's eyes gleamed. The hook was set. "Of course. Anything to help the team." She walked away, her heels clicking softly against the thin industrial carpet. I sat in silence for a long moment, listening to the hum of the air conditioner. Then I turned back to my monitor, opened the master presentation file, and began to type. 30 minutes passed in a blur of keystrokes. The presentation I had built was flawless. It was a comprehensive roadmap for acquiring a struggling regional supply chain competitor. It detailed their debt structure, their operational inefficiencies, and a ruthlessly efficient integration plan. It was the kind of work that guaranteed a promotion. But perfect wasn't going to save me. Perfect was what Jessica would steal. If I was going to let her take the credit, I needed to make sure she took all of it, including the fatal flaws. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. A heavy, sickening guilt pulled at my chest. I considered myself a professional, a good person even. Sabotaging a company document felt like a violation of my own core principles. It was petty. It was malicious. But she's going to steal it anyway, my brain whispered. She's going to ruin you. Again. I exhaled a shaky breath and opened the appendix slides. Damian Preston was a micromanager who obsessed over legal compliance. He had survived an SEC audit early in his career, and the trauma had turned him into a paranoiac regarding data sourcing. If a number wasn't vetted, stamped, and legally cleared, it didn't exist in his boardroom. I navigated to the final financial projection slide. It was a beautiful, upward trending graph showing a 22% margin increase post-acquisition. I selected the data table driving the graph. Then I started building the trap. I didn't alter the numbers manually. That would be too obvious. Jessica might notice if she actually bothered to proofread the slides. Instead, I wrote a simple macro, a piece of code embedded in the presentation's background. It was designed to trigger only when the presentation was put into presenter mode, while connected to the specific IP address of the executive boardroom's secure Wi-Fi network. When triggered, the macro would refresh the data from a hidden, locally linked Excel sheet I had just created. I opened that new Excel sheet. My hands were sweating. I wiped my palms on my slacks. I began pulling data from a highly confidential internal audit regarding the target company, an audit that we legally were not supposed to have access to, yet due to a pending antitrust review. Using that data in a forward-facing projection before the merger was finalized wasn't just frowned upon. It was corporate espionage. It was a direct violation of a federal non-disclosure agreement. I fed the illicit data into the hidden sheet. The numbers shifted. The beautiful 22% margin remained, but the footnotes and data source citations at the bottom of the slide automatically updated. They now clearly referenced the restricted, embargoed audit files. To anyone glancing at the slides on a laptop, it looked identical to my original legal presentation. But the moment those slides went up on the massive 80-inch screen in the boardroom, the citations would be blown up for Damian Preston and the entire legal team to see. And whoever was presenting it would be claiming full responsibility for acquiring and utilizing illegal data. I saved the file. My heart was pounding a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs. I felt dirty. The air in my cubicle suddenly felt suffocating, thick with the smell of warm electronics and stale breath. I rubbed my temples, closing my eyes, against the glare of the screen. Is this who I am now, I thought? Am I really doing this? Yes, I was, because the alternative was unemployment and a shattered reputation. The alternative was watching Jessica smile that tight plastic smile while I packed my life into a cardboard box. I opened a secondary folder. This was the bait. I created a new folder on my desktop and named it final_Q3_deck_do_not_share. A desperate, pathetic title that practically screamed at a thief to open it. I moved the rigged presentation inside. Then I looked at the clock. 11:45 a.m. lunchtime. In the previous timeline, this was when I stayed at my desk, eating a sad salad, while double-checking my formatting. Jessica had waited until I finally cracked and went to the restroom at 2 p.m. to make her move. This time, I was going to make it easy for her. I stood up. My knees felt weak, trembling slightly under my weight. I grabbed my purse from the bottom drawer. I didn't lock my computer screen. The glowing desktop with the final folder sitting dead center illuminated my empty chair. I walked past Jessica's desk. She was typing furiously, her eyes glued to her screen. "I'm grabbing lunch," I said, keeping my tone casual, fighting the tremor in my voice. "You need anything from downstairs?" Jessica looked up, surprised. She glanced past me, her eyes locking onto my cubicle for a fraction of a second. She noted the lack of a screensaver, the unguarded computer. "No, I brought a salad," she said smoothly. "Take your time. You've been working hard." "Thanks," I muttered. I turned and walked toward the elevators. The walk felt like a march to the gallows. Every step echoed loudly in my own ears. I pressed the down button, watching the metal doors slide open. As I stepped inside and turned around, I caught a glimpse of the office floor before the doors closed. Jessica was already standing up. The cafeteria in the basement smelled of fried oil, bleached floors, and overcooked broccoli. I sat in a plastic booth in the far corner, a styrofoam container of untouched pasta in front of me. The ambient noise of hundreds of employees talking over one another washed over me, but I couldn't focus on any of it. I felt completely detached from my physical body. The fork in my hand felt too light. The harsh fluorescent lights overhead seemed to strobe in slow motion. 45 minutes. I stayed down there for 45 agonizing minutes. I forced myself to drink a bottle of water, focusing on the cold liquid sliding down my throat to ground myself. I kept checking my watch. The leather strap was slick with sweat against my wrist. If I was wrong, if she didn't take the bait, if she somehow decided to do her own work this time, I had just left a rigged illegal document on my desktop. I would have to delete it before the end of the day and scramble to put together a clean version for tomorrow. The uncertainty gnawed at the lining of my stomach. At 12:35 p.m., I stood up. I tossed the heavy, uneaten pasta into the trash. The styrofoam squeaked against the plastic bag. The elevator ride back to the 4th floor took an eternity. The mechanical whir of the cables sounded like a countdown. When the doors finally chimed and parted, I stepped out onto the familiar gray carpet. The office was exactly as I had left it. The same phones ringing, the same muted conversations. I walked slowly down the aisle toward my desk. My eyes instantly locked onto my workstation. At first glance, nothing had changed. The monitor was still awake. The desktop background, a generic landscape of a misty forest, stared back at me. The final folder sat exactly where I left it. I sat down. The cushion of the chair was cold. I reached for the mouse. My hand hesitated. I closed my eyes, took a breath, and grabbed it. I right-clicked the folder and selected Properties. A small gray box popped up on the screen. Accessed today, 12:02 p.m. A sharp exhale punched out of my lungs. She had opened it. I opened the folder and checked the file properties of the presentation itself. Last copied today, 12:04 p.m. She took it. I slumped back in my chair. The tension that had been holding my spine rigid for the last 3 hours suddenly vanished, leaving me feeling hollow and exhausted. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes. I expected to feel victorious. I expected a rush of vindication, a hit of dopamine for outsmarting the person who had ruined me. Instead, I just felt sad. Sad for the toxic, cutthroat environment we existed in. Sad that a woman I had shared coffee with, complained about management with, had so easily, so casually decided to steal my labor to elevate herself. The betrayal was real, even if I had engineered the mechanics of it this time around. Good lunch. I jumped, dropping my hands. Jessica was leaning over the partition again. She had a fresh coat of lip gloss on. Her eyes were bright, buzzing with the frantic energy of someone who thinks they've just won the lottery. It was fine, I managed to say. My voice was steady, surprising me. Good. You look a little less pale, she said, tapping her French manicured fingernails against the top of the partition. I'm going to put my head down for the rest of the afternoon, trying to finalize my own slides for tomorrow. Damien's going to be in a mood. I can feel it. Yeah, I agreed, looking her dead in the eye. He usually is. Well, she smiled a genuine, relaxed smile, because she finally had what she needed. See you on the other side. She sat back down. I listened to the muffled sound of her plugging a USB drive into her docking station. She was transferring the file to her secure drive. She was probably going to strip my name off the title slide right now, replacing it with Jessica Croft. I turned back to my monitor. Now came the hardest part. I had to ensure she was the only one presenting tomorrow. I reached under my desk and located the thick black Ethernet cable connecting my docking station to the company network. I gripped the plastic tab squeezed and pulled it out just a fraction of an inch. Not enough to look disconnected, but enough to break the hardware connection. Then I opened a command prompt on my computer, With a few deliberate keystrokes, I initiated a continuous ping loop to a dead internal server address, while simultaneously opening 20 instances of our heaviest data modeling software. The computer's cooling fan immediately kicked into high gear, whining like a jet engine. The screen froze. The mouse cursor turned into a spinning blue circle, then locked entirely. I sat there and watched my workstation commit digital suicide. I didn't call IT. I didn't try to reboot. I just sat in the manufactured chill of the office, listening to the fan scream, waiting for 5 p.m. to arrive. The trap was set. The bait was taken. My alibi, a catastrophic hardware failure the afternoon before the big meeting, was currently melting its own CPU. There was nothing left to do now but wait for the execution. The drive home that evening was a blur of brake lights and gray rain. The windshield wipers dragged back and forth with a rhythmic, rubbery squeak. The smell of damp wool from my coat filled the small cabin of my sedan. I parked in my driveway, cut the engine, and just sat in the dark. The rain drummed against the roof of the car. Tomorrow, the world was going to break wide open. Tomorrow, Jessica would stand in the boardroom and present stolen illegal data to the most unforgiving CEO in the state. I rested my forehead against the cold leather of the steering wheel. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the architect, and God help me. The anticipation was starting to make me smile. Rainwater, from the night before, still clung to my windshield, distorting the red glow of the traffic lights into blurry streaks. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The heater was blasting, blowing dry, hot air directly into my face, but I couldn't stop shivering. It wasn't the autumn chill. It was the adrenaline, sour and persistent, pooling in the pit of my stomach. Stepping off the elevator at 8:15 a.m., the office felt entirely different. Yesterday, it was a purgatory of fluorescent lights and endless busywork. Today, it was a crime scene waiting to be discovered. The air smelled strongly of industrial floor wax and stale bagels from the morning catering cart. I walked to my desk, keeping my head down. My posture slumped. The performance had to start immediately. My computer was exactly how I had left it, a black, unresponsive screen. The cooling fan had finally burned itself out overnight, leaving the tower ominously silent. I dropped my bag on the floor with a heavy thud. I jiggled the mouse. Nothing. I tapped the space bar. Nothing. I pressed the power button, holding it down for 10 seconds, then 20. A hollow clicking sound echoed from the hard drive, casing followed by a faint smell of melting plastic. Kevin, I called out, injecting a tremor of genuine panic into my voice. Kevin from IT sat 3 rows over, usually buried behind a dual-monitor setup, playing whatever obscure MMO he was obsessed with that month. He popped his head up, his oversized headphones resting around his neck. "My computer is dead," I said, my breathing growing shallow. "Kevin, it won't turn on. I have the Q3 presentation in an hour." He sighed, grabbing a lanyard of flash drives, and trudged over. Kevin smelled like stale corn chips and peppermint gum. He wedged himself under my desk, his knees popping against the thin carpet. He grunted, pulling cables, resetting the power strip. 10 minutes passed. A small crowd had started to form. "Ma, the motherboard is fried," Kevin finally announced, pulling himself out from under the desk. His shirt was covered in gray dust bunnies. "Drive is totally locked up. I can pull it and try to run a recovery, but that's a 4-hour process minimum. Did you back it up to the cloud server?" My throat closed up. The tears that pricked my eyes weren't entirely fake. The sheer, overwhelming stress of the lie was suffocating. No, I whispered, digging my nails into my palms until it hurt. The file was too large. I was doing local edits. Kevin, you have to fix it. The executive board is waiting. I can't magically unmelt hardware. Corliss, he said, sounding defensive. It's gone. I let out a ragged sob, dropping my face into my hands. The texture of my own skin felt foreign, cold, and clammy. Oh my God! Oh my God, Damien is going to fire me. I let the words hang in the air, exactly as they had played out in the previous timeline. Only this time, I was the one directing the scene. Right on cue, the scent of synthetic vanilla cut through the stale office air. What's going on? Jessica pushed her way through the small knot of rubbernecking coworkers. She was wearing a tailored hunter green sheath dress. She looked sharp, ready for a magazine cover, ready to conquer. Corliss's drive crashed, someone muttered. The Q3 deck is gone. Jessica's eyes widened in a pitch-perfect display of shock. But I caught the micro-tremor in her jaw, the suppressed thrill. She had the file. She knew she had it. And now she had the perfect, unimpeachable excuse to use it. Corliss, Jessica said, her voice dripping with maternal concern. She placed a warm, heavy hand on my shoulder. The contact made my skin crawl. Breathe. It's going to be okay. How is it going to be okay? I choked out, looking up at her through my fingers. The alignment meeting is at 10. We have nothing to show them. Not nothing, Jessica said smoothly. She straightened her posture, addressing not just me, but the small crowd of witnesses. I noticed you were struggling yesterday. I stayed late and put together a contingency deck. It covers the macro trends and the acquisition strategy. It's not your exact work, obviously, but it will save us from going in empty-handed. The murmurs of approval from our co-workers were sickening. Wow, what a team player. Jessica really stepped up. You did, I asked, widening my eyes, playing the pathetic, grateful victim to the hilt. Of course, she smiled, giving my shoulder a final squeeze. We're a team. You go take a walk, get some coffee. I'll talk to Damien and explain the technical failure, and I'll handle the presentation. She turned and walked away, her heels striking the floor in a steady, victorious rhythm. She was going to the boardroom to set up. She was going to plug her USB drive and load my stolen presentation and claim the glory. I sat back in my chair, staring at the black monitor. My heart was beating so hard, it rattled my ribs. The trap was locked. At 9:55 a.m., I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the executive boardroom on the top floor. The air conditioning in here was set 10 degrees lower than the rest of the building, designed to keep people alert and uncomfortable. It smelled of expensive leather-polished mahogany and the faint ozone tang of the massive laser projector humming in the ceiling. I took a seat in the back corner near the catering table. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to tuck them under my thighs to hide the tremor. The executives filed in. They were a parade of gray suits and heavy watches, moving with the sluggish arrogance of people who made 7 figures to complain about margins. Then Damien Preston entered. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 5 degrees. Damien wasn't a tall man, but he carried a dense gravitational authority that made people instinctively hold their breath when he walked by. His suit was charcoal, perfectly tailored, devoid of a single wrinkle. He didn't speak as he walked to the head of the long table. He just sat down, unscrewed the cap of his Mont Blanc pen, and placed it parallel to his legal pad. "Let's get this over with," Damien said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that scraped against the eardrums. "I have a flight at 1." At the front of the room, standing beside the 80-inch projection screen, Jessica looked radiant. She didn't flinch under Damien's freezing glare. She clicked the remote in her hand. The screen flashed bright white, then resolved into the title slide. Q3 Strategic Alignment and Acquisition Roadmap. Prepared by Jessica Croft. Seeing my work, 6 weeks of late nights, cold dinners, and skipped weekends with her name plastered across the front sent a hot spike of genuine rage through my chest. The anger grounded me. The guilt I had felt yesterday completely evaporated. "Good morning, Damien. Board members," Jessica began. Her voice was smooth, confident, perfectly modulated. "Before we begin, I want to note a slight pivot. Due to a catastrophic hardware failure at Corliss's workstation this morning, her data was lost. However, anticipating some bottlenecks in her workflow, I took the liberty of compiling a comprehensive alternative strategy overnight." Damien didn't look up from his notepad. "I don't care about IT excuses, Jessica. I care about numbers. Impress me, or let's all go back to work." Jessica's smile tightened, but she didn't waver. "Of course." She clicked the remote. For the next 20 minutes, I sat in the freezing room and watched Jessica Croft deliver the performance of her life. She was a phenomenal presenter. I had to give her that. She moved through the slides with natural rhythm, pausing for emphasis, answering minor questions from the board members with ease. She was selling my narrative perfectly. The supply chain bottlenecks, the synergistic value of the target company, the operational redundancies we could eliminate. Damien stopped writing. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. He was actually nodding. "Your understanding of their logistical shortfalls is surprisingly deep, Jessica," Damien said, his tone bordering on actual respect. "This is thorough, much more aggressive than the preliminary briefs." "Thank you, Damien," Jessica practically purred. She glanced toward the back of the room, meeting my eyes for a fraction of a second. The smug superiority radiating from her face was blinding. "I believe in digging deeper than the surface metrics." My stomach clenched. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, slicking my hairline. "Here it comes. Let's look at the financials," Damien said, gesturing with his pen. "If we execute this buyout, what does the integration cost look like against their current debt load?" "I'm glad you asked," Jessica said, turning back to the screen. She clicked the remote. The slide transitioned. The title read, "Post-Acquisition Margin Projections." This was it. The moment the presentation entered presenter mode on this specific, highly secure executive Wi-Fi network, the beautiful upward trending bar graph appeared on the screen. For a split second, it looked entirely normal. Then the screen flickered. A tiny, almost imperceptible loading wheel spun in the bottom right corner as my embedded macro triggered reaching out to the hidden Excel file, buried deep in the folder she had copied. The graph adjusted. The bars shifted slightly, incorporating the new data. But the most crucial change happened in the dense block of text at the very bottom of the slide. The footnotes. Because Jessica was in presenter mode on an 80-inch 4K screen, the small text at the bottom was magnified. It was crisp. It was incredibly legible. Damien Preston leaned forward. He squinted at the screen. The rhythmic tapping of his pen against the mahogany table stopped. The silence in the room suddenly felt incredibly heavy. "Jessica," Damien said. His voice was no longer a gravelly baritone. It was a sharp, terrifying hiss. "Yes, Damien." As you can see, the 22% margin increase is largely driven by red footnote 4. Jessica blinked. The confident mask slipped for a second, replaced by genuine confusion. She turned her head to look at the massive screen behind her. I'm sorry. Read footnote 4. Damien enunciated every syllable, sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. Out loud, Jessica swallowed hard. She stepped closer to the screen, her eyes scanning the bottom of the slide. Data sourced from... She squinted. Her voice caught in her throat. She stopped reading. Keep going, Damien ordered, standing up slowly from his chair. Jessica's face went completely ashen. The color drained from her cheeks so fast, she looked ill. Data sourced from internal audit document, SEC pending. File Alpha 7. A collective gasp echoed from the far side of the table. The chief legal officer, a terrifying woman named Sarah, physically recoiled in her chair, slapping her hands flat on the table. File Alpha 7. Sarah demanded, her voice rising an octave. That's the embargoed antitrust audit. That file is under a federal lock. Jessica stammered, stepping back from the screen as if it were radioactive. I don't. Where did you get these numbers? Damien's voice was dangerously quiet now. He was staring at Jessica like she was a venomous snake that had just crawled onto his desk. How do you have access to a legally embargoed audit? And why, in God's name, would you project it on a screen in front of a dozen people before the merger is federally approved? Damien, I didn't... Jessica's eyes darted wildly around the room. She was hyperventilating, the flawless composure, shattering into a million jagged pieces. She looked at me. Pure, unadulterated terror radiated from her face. She opened her mouth, ready to throw me under the bus, ready to scream that it was my file, my presentation. But she couldn't, because for the last 20 minutes, she had stood in front of the entire executive board and explicitly claimed that she had built this presentation from scratch. She had claimed she did the research overnight. She had put her name on the title slide. If she blamed me now, she was admitting to corporate theft in front of the CEO. If she didn't blame me, she was admitting to corporate espionage and federal non-disclosure violations. The trap hadn't just caught her leg, it was wrapped around her throat. Silence stretched so tight, it threatened to shatter the floor-to-ceiling windows. The hum of the laser projector suddenly sounded like a jet engine in the suffocating quiet. Nobody moved. A dozen highly paid executives sat frozen in their leather chairs, their eyes darting between the damning text on the 80-inch screen and the pale, trembling woman standing beneath it. Jessica's throat worked frantically as she swallowed. The meticulously applied foundation on her face seemed to crack under the harsh fluorescent glare. She looked down at the remote in her hand, as if it had suddenly turned into a live grenade. Damien, there has to be a mistake, she stammered. Her voice was a thin, reedy whisper, completely stripped of its previous confident polish. A formatting error. The software must have pulled the wrong citation label. A formatting error, Damien repeated. He didn't yell. The terrifying thing about Damien Preston was that his anger was cold, precise, and utterly devoid of volume. He picked up his Mont Blanc pen and tapped it once against the mahogany table. The sound cracked like a whip. A software glitch independently located a highly classified, password-protected federal audit drive, extracted specific numerical projections, and appended them perfectly into your footnote structure. Jessica took a step back, her heel catching slightly on the thick carpet. She stumbled, barely catching her balance. The predatory grace was gone. She was just a terrified animal, backed into a corner. I didn't open that file. Jessica pleaded, her breathing growing ragged and loud. She looked toward Sarah, the chief legal officer, whose face was set in a mask of absolute horror. Sarah, I swear I don't even have access permissions for the Alpha 7 drive, which makes this infinitely worse, Sarah snapped. She stood up her chair, rolling back and hitting the credenza with a dull thud. She didn't look at Jessica. She pointed directly at the IT director sitting near the door. Kill the Wi-Fi in this room. Now, disconnect the router. If a packet sniffer from the SEC catches us bouncing embargoed data across a wireless network, we're all going to federal prison. The IT director scrambled under the side table, ripping cables from the wall port. The massive screen flickered, then reverted to a blue, no-signal default. The abrupt loss of the slide didn't ease the tension. It amplified it. The evidence was gone, leaving only the crushing reality of what had just happened. Jessica's eyes darted wildly. The panic was consuming her, overriding her carefully constructed corporate persona. She needed a lifeline. She needed a scapegoat. Her head snapped toward the back of the room. Her eyes locked onto mine. A surge of electricity shot down my spine. The metallic taste of adrenaline flooded the back of my tongue. I sat perfectly still, my hands locked together under my thighs. I forced my expression to remain wide-eyed, frightened, and utterly confused. It was her, Jessica breathed, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. It was Corliss's file. The executives turned in their chairs, a dozen pairs of eyes fixed on me. Corliss's computer crashed. Jessica said, her voice rising in pitch, crossing the threshold into hysteria. I went to her backup folder. I used her baseline data. She must have put the illegal numbers in there. She set me up. I didn't say a word. I just shrank back into my chair, letting my shoulders round, playing the overwhelmed, insignificant analyst. Damien looked at me, then slowly turned his gaze back to Jessica. The disgust rolling off him was palpable. It smelled like expensive cologne, mixed with pure contempt. Let me make sure I understand this, Damien said softly, leaning forward over the table. 10 minutes ago, you stood there and delivered a monologue about how you stayed up all night to build this presentation from scratch to save the team from Corliss's technical failures. Sigh, I lied. Jessica shrieked tears, finally spilling over her lower lashes, carving wet streaks through her makeup. I lied. I took her file. I copied it from her desktop before lunch yesterday. It's her work. So, Damien said, his voice dropping to a glacial chill, you are either a corporate spy attempting to sabotage a billion-dollar merger, or you are a thief who stole a subordinate's work, lied to this board, and accidentally presented illegal data because you were too stupid to proofread what you stole. Jessica let out a choked, wet sob. She covered her mouth with her hand, realizing the trap she had just willingly stepped into. There was no third option. Both doors led to execution. She couldn't form a sentence. Her shoulders shook violently. Sarah. Damien didn't even look at the legal officer. He kept his dead, unblinking eyes fixed on Jessica. Call HR. Call building security. Revoke her badge, her network access, and her company phone. If she touches a keyboard before she leaves this building, I'll hold you personally responsible. Wait, please, Jessica begged, taking a step toward the table, her hands reaching out in a desperate, pleading gesture. Damien, I've given 5 years to this company. You can check the server logs. You can see I copied it from Corliss. "Get out of my boardroom," Damien whispered. Jessica stood, frozen for 3 agonizing seconds. The silence returned thicker and heavier than before. The only sound was the jagged, wet intake of her breath. She looked around the table, searching for a single sympathetic face. She found nothing but stone. Finally, she turned. Her shoulders collapsed inward, the immaculate green sheath dress suddenly looking 2 sizes too big. She walked toward the heavy oak doors. She didn't look at me as she passed. She just kept her eyes on the carpet, a broken hollow shell of the woman who had smirked at me over a cubicle partition yesterday. The door clicked shut behind her. Damien leaned back in his chair, picking up his Mont Blanc pen. He uncapped it smoothly. Sarah initiate a full forensic sweep of Jessica's workstation and Corliss's crashed drive. He commanded his tone, instantly shifting back to flat operational efficiency. "I want absolute confirmation on the origin of that data leak by 5 o'clock. If the SEC breathes in our direction, we hand them Jessica Croft on a silver platter." He finally looked at me, sitting in the shadows at the back of the room. His gaze was unreadable, dark, calculating, and piercing. "Phillips," he said. "Yes, sir." I managed to whisper, my throat raw. "Go back to your desk. Find it. Get a working computer, rebuild the clean projections, and have them on my desk by tomorrow morning." He paused, his eyes narrowing just a fraction of an inch. "Do not disappoint me." The walk back to the 4th floor felt like wading through wet concrete. My knees were dangerously loose, and a cold sweat clung to my undershirt. I had won. The threat was neutralized. The timeline was fixed. But there was no soaring orchestral music in my head. There was no triumphant slow-motion strut down the hallway. My stomach roiled with a sickening mixture of relief and profound self-loathing. I had watched a human being professionally disintegrate. I had built the bomb, placed it in her hands, and watched her detonate it. When I pushed through the glass doors of the 4th floor bullpen, the atmosphere was entirely different from the quiet hum of the morning. It was electric. A hushed, frantic energy buzzed in the air. Gossip was moving through the cubicles faster than a network virus. I walked slowly down the aisle. Jessica was already at her desk. Standing over her was Greg, from HR, a perpetually nervous man with a receding hairline, and 2 large security guards in gray uniforms. The sound of thick packing tape tearing off a roll ripped through the quiet office. Jessica was throwing things into a standard-issue cardboard banker's box. She wasn't crying anymore. The panic had burned out, leaving behind a hard, brittle fury. Her movements were jerky and violent. She grabbed her framed degree, her ergonomic mousepad, her spare heels. The ceramic mug with the generic motivational quote went into the box with a loud clank. Nobody was looking directly at her, but everyone was watching. The side eyes from over monitors. The fake intense focus on spreadsheets. It was the brutal silent excommunication of corporate culture. Yesterday, she was a rising star. Today, she was a contagion. I reached my desk and stood behind my chair. I didn't sit down. Jessica grabbed a stack of unread mail and shoved it into the cardboard box. She picked the box up. It was heavy, forcing her to lean backward to carry it. She turned to walk down the aisle, her security escort falling in step beside her. As she passed my cubicle, she stopped. Greg, from HR, immediately tensed, reaching a hand out. "Jessica, please, let's just keep moving to the elevator." Jessica ignored him. She turned her head and looked directly into my eyes. The venom in her stare was absolute. Her makeup was streaked, her hair fraying from its perfect bun, but her eyes burned with a terrifying clarity. She knew. She had finally processed the sequence of events. The conveniently left open folder, the perfectly timed hardware crash, the hyper-specific lethal nature of the data she had stolen. She knew I didn't just let her steal it. She knew I had gift-wrapped a landmine. "You set me up," Jessica hissed, her voice, low, raspy, meant only for me. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my face remained entirely still. I didn't offer a villainous smirk. I didn't lean in to whisper a clever one-liner. The reality of what I had done weighed too heavily on my bones for theatrics. I just looked at her, matching her intensity with a cold, dead-eyed exhaustion. "You set yourself up, Jessica," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I just left the door open." Her jaw tightened. A muscle twitched furiously in her cheek. She wanted to scream. She wanted to drop the box and lunge over the partition. But the security guards shifted closer. Their presence, a heavy physical reminder that she had no power left in this building. She adjusted her grip on the cardboard box, the rough edges digging into her perfect manicure, and walked away. I watched her back until she disappeared into the elevator bay. The door slid shut, sealing her out of my life permanently. I slowly sank into my chair. The fabric was rough against my legs. My dead monitor still sat on the desk, an empty black mirror reflecting my own pale, tired face. An hour later, Kevin from IT dropped a loaner laptop onto my desk with a heavy sigh. "Forensics took your old drive," he grunted, unwrapping a stick of peppermint gum. "Legal is freaking out. They locked down Jessica's network profile entirely." "Thanks, Kevin," I mumbled, flipping the laptop open. "Hey," he said, pausing before he walked away. He looked at me, a rare expression of genuine sympathy crossing his face. "Sorry your deck got stolen." She was always a shark, glad she finally choked on something. He walked away before I could respond. I stared at the glowing Windows login screen. The air conditioning clicked on, blowing a stream of chilled air over the back of my neck. I typed in my credentials. My phone buzzed on the desk. I jumped, my nerves completely shot. I looked down at the caller ID. It was an internal extension. Preston Damien. My mouth went dry. I picked up the receiver, my hand shaking so badly, the plastic rattled against my ear. "Phillips," I answered. "My office. 5 minutes." The gravelly baritone commanded. A click followed, severing the connection. I closed my eyes. The forensic sweep. He ordered a forensic sweep of the drives. Had they already found the macro? Had they found the digital footprints I left when I pulled the embargoed data? I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles out of my slacks. My legs felt like lead. The game wasn't over. Jessica was gone, but the architect of the explosion was still standing in the blast radius. I walked toward the elevators, heading back up to the freezing air of the executive floor. I had to face the man who had just executed my rival, and I had to convince him that I wasn't the monster who had handed him the gun. Stepping onto the top floor felt like entering a vacuum chamber. The plush, charcoal gray carpet absorbed all ambient sound, deadening my footsteps into dull thuds. The air up here didn't smell of cheap toner and microwaved lunches. It smelled of lemon oil ozone and the sharp, bitter bite of fresh espresso. Damien's assistant, a severe woman with immaculate silver hair, didn't even look up from her dual monitors as I approached. She simply raised a manicured finger and pointed toward the heavy mahogany door at the end of the hall. My palm slipped on the brass handle. I wiped my clammy hand against the fabric of my slacks, took a shallow breath, that barely filled the top of my lungs and pushed the door open. Damien's office was cavernous, dominated by a floor-to-ceiling glass wall overlooking the slate-gray sprawl of the city. Rain lashed against the thick panes in erratic, violent bursts, distorting the skyline into a watery blur. Damien stood by the window, his back to me, holding a small porcelain cup. He didn't turn around when the door clicked shut. "Sit, Phillips." The leather guest chair sighed under my weight. It was cold. I kept my knees pressed tight together, my hands resting rigidly in my lap. On Damien's massive, uncluttered desk sat a single manila folder. The red, confidential stamp on the cover seemed to vibrate under the recessed lighting. Damien took a slow sip of his espresso. The clink of the cup against the saucer was the only sound in the room. He finally turned around, his expression as unreadable and hard as polished granite. He walked to the desk, pulled his chair out, and sat down. He opened the manila folder. "IT pushed a priority forensic sweep on both your crashed drive and Jessica's workstation." Damien said, his gravelly voice dropping the temperature in the room. He ran a finger down a printed log sheet. "They recovered the corrupted master file from your hard drive before the motherboard melted. They also pulled the metadata from Jessica's copy." My chest tightened until my ribs ached. I forced myself to maintain eye contact, though every instinct screamed at me to look at the floor. "Do you know what a macro is, Corliss?" he asked, not looking up from the paper. "Yes," I said. My voice cracked slightly. I cleared my throat and tried again, aiming for flat neutrality. "It's an automated input sequence. A script." "Correct." Damien leaned back, steepling his fingers. It found a very interesting script embedded in the background of the presentation Jessica delivered. A script designed to remain entirely dormant unless the file was projected on a screen using the specific IP address of my boardroom. He let the sentence hang in the air. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. A bead of sweat broke loose from my hairline and slid down the back of my neck. "The script," Damien continued, his eyes finally locking onto mine, piercing right through the facade I was desperately trying to hold up, was hard-coded to ping the Alpha 7 drive, extract the embargoed margin projections, and rewrite the footnote citations in real time. It was an incredibly sophisticated piece of digital sabotage. I stopped breathing. He knew. He had the mechanical proof. The timeline of who built the trap didn't matter to him. The existence of the trap itself was enough to end me. Jessica Croft was a parasite. Damien stated, his tone shifting from investigative to conversational, which was somehow far more terrifying. "I've known that for 2 years. She managed upwards beautifully, but she produced nothing of original value. She fed on the work of her subordinates. I tolerated her because she was an effective mouthpiece." He closed the folder. "But a parasite doesn't write a geographic IP-triggered script to pull federal audit data. A parasite isn't smart enough to build a bomb." Damien leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "You built it, didn't you, Phillips? You knew she was stealing your work. You knew she would present it today. You fed her a poison pill." Denial sat on the tip of my tongue. It would be so easy to cry, to play the victim, to claim someone else hacked my system. But looking into Damien Preston's cold, calculating eyes, I realized that playing the victim was exactly what would get me fired. He didn't respect victims. He respected leverage. He respected power. My hands stopped shaking. A strange, cynical calm washed over me, numbing the panic. I wasn't the timid analyst who had packed her box yesterday. I was the architect of the explosion he just witnessed. I sat up straighter. I let the mask of the frightened subordinate fall away. I suspected she was accessing my terminal when I stepped away. I said, my voice steady, stripped of any emotional tremor. I couldn't prove it to HR without her claiming it was a collaborative misunderstanding. If I confronted her, she would just find a way to discredit me. So I built a honeypot. Damien didn't blink. He just watched me processing the shift in my demeanor. I placed a dummy folder on my desktop right before lunch. I continued holding his gaze. I left my terminal unlocked. I gave her the rope. She chose to put it around her own neck. You risked a federal antitrust violation to settle a cubicle rivalry, Damien said softly. I risked nothing. I countered the words, leaving my mouth before I could overthink them. The macro was completely contained. It was designed to trigger only in a controlled environment where the data couldn't leave the room. It exposed a thief, a liar, and a massive security liability in your middle management. I solved your parasite problem, Damien. For 5 agonizing seconds, the only sound was the rain hammering against the glass. Damien stared at me. I could see the gears turning behind his dark eyes, evaluating the ruthless pragmatism of what I had done. Then the corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the closest thing to approval I had ever seen on his face. You're a liability, Phillips, he murmured, picking up his Mont Blanc pen. I'm effective, I replied, refusing to back down. Damien unscrewed the cap of the pen. You have until 8 a.m. tomorrow. You will rebuild the clean legal projections. You will format them perfectly. If you are off by a single decimal point, or if you ever pull a stunt like this in my company again, I won't just fire you. I will make sure you never work in corporate finance in this hemisphere again. He looked back down at his desk, dismissing me. Are we clear? Crystal, I said. I stood up. My legs held my weight perfectly. I walked out of the office, past the silver-haired assistant, and stepped into the elevator. When the doors closed, I finally let out the breath I felt like I had been holding for 2 lifetimes. The glow of the loaner laptop burned my retinas. It was 11:45 p.m. The bullpen was a graveyard of empty ergonomic chairs and powered-down monitors. The cleaning crew had come and gone hours ago, leaving behind the sharp scent of lemon ammonia that mingled poorly with the stale coffee rotting in my mug. My shoulders were locked into hard, painful knots. My fingertips felt bruised from hammering the keys, but the slide deck was finished. It was a masterpiece of clean, legal, ruthlessly vetted data. No hidden macros, no stolen audits, just 70 pages of airtight strategic alignment. I saved the file to 3 separate encrypted drives and emailed a copy directly to Damien's assistant. I pushed away from the desk and rubbed my eyes until sparks danced in the darkness. In the previous timeline, I had spent this exact hour lying awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how I was going to pay my mortgage after being publicly humiliated and fired. I had sobbed until my throat was raw. I had felt utterly powerless, chewed up and spat out by a machine that didn't even know my name. This time, I had taken control of the machine. I grabbed my coat and walked toward the elevators. The silence of the empty office was heavy, pressing against my eardrums. I passed Jessica's empty desk. The bare laminate surface looked unnaturally clean under the dim security lighting. The outline of where her monitor used to sit was still faintly visible in the dust, a hollow, echoing sensation settled in the pit of my stomach. I pressed the button for the parking garage. The elevator hummed a low, mechanical vibration that traveled up through the soles of my shoes. I had won. I had kept my job. I had impressed a CEO who terrified grown men. I had successfully navigated a temporal anomaly to exact perfect revenge on the woman who ruined my life. But as the elevator doors chimed and slid open to the damp, concrete-scented air of the parking garage, I didn't feel victorious. The air was crisp and painfully cold. I pulled my coat tighter around my chest, walking toward my sedan. The harsh, yellow sodium lights buzzed overhead, casting long, distorted shadows across the asphalt. I unlocked the car and slid into the driver's seat. The leather was freezing. I put the key in the ignition, but didn't turn it. I just sat there, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine block from the car parked next to me. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. The woman staring back at me looked identical to the one who had woken up with her face pressed against a sticky desk yesterday morning. Dark circles bruised the skin under her eyes. Her hair was limp and frizzy from the dry office air. But she wasn't the same. To survive the snake pit, I had to become the deadliest thing in it. I had used federal data as a weapon. I had looked a weeping, terrified woman in the eyes and felt nothing but cold satisfaction as she was destroyed. I had sat in an executive office and bartered my own ruthless capacity for sabotage in exchange for corporate approval. I reached out and traced the edge of the steering wheel. The textured leather was familiar grounding. I wasn't a hero. I hadn't fixed a broken system. I had just learned how to manipulate the levers better than Jessica Croft did. I had adapted to the toxicity. I had let the venom in, and I had weaponized it. I turned the key. The engine roared to life, the dashboard illuminating the dark cabin with a soft, sterile blue light. The digital clock on the console read 12:01 a.m. It was Wednesday. The loop was closed. The day of my firing had officially passed, rewritten into a day of brutal, undeniable survival. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the parking space. The tires hissed against the damp concrete. As I drove up the ramp and merged onto the empty, rain-slicked city streets, the lingering smell of the office finally faded from my clothes, replaced by the cold, metallic scent of the autumn night. I survived. I was reborn, and I was exactly where I belonged. And that's the brutal reality of the corporate machine. Corliss didn't just survive the game. She rewrote the rules and became the apex predator. Did she go too far, or did Jessica get exactly what she deserved? Let me know in the comments below. If this story had your heart pounding, smash that like button, share it with a coworker who needs to hear this, and make sure you subscribe. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a single story. We upload wild revenge dramas every single week. See you in the next one.